everyone, welcome to the February 7th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and this week we're looking back at the last week in racing. Some major 3-year-old Kentucky Derby prep races took place at Santa Anita and Gulfstream Park, the Robert B. Lewis and the Holy Bull. We'll talk about both of those, as well as other stakes action at both of those venues. They ran, I think, 4 graded stakes on Saturday at Santa Anita, some more on Sunday. We'll discuss as many of those as we could fit in. Also, some interesting allowance and maiden races that took place both at Santa Anita and Gulfstream Park. Also some 3-year-olds that did not compete in either of those points-eligible Derby preps that might be moving into stakes company in their next starts that are worth discussing. So we'll try to cover as many of those as we can. Then we'll move on to Tampa Bay Downs, where they ran a couple of turf stakes on Saturday. Oaklawn Park, a couple of noteworthy speed figures, including a 3-year-old that could insert himself into the Derby picture. And then we'll wrap things up with a couple of allowance races that did achieve some notable speed figures at Aqueduct and even Parks. And I'm happy to have back on the podcast this week my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski. Craig, I know there were some circumstances last week that forced you to bypass some of the video and podcast work that we usually do, and on top of that you ended up being under the weather, so I'm glad to have you back this week feeling better.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back. I feel much better. I had the dreaded C word for the second time. Not sure how I wound up with that, but well, just like a bad cold. I didn't get too ill or anything. So I'm good to go and ready to fire.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about on the podcast this week, and let's start off with California. They did run those 4 graded stakes on Saturday, included among them the Grade 3 Robert B. Lewis Derby prep for the 3-year-olds, and this was the all-Baffert affair, Craig. They did offer wagering on this race, but it did feel more like an exhibition race, just with these 4 Bob Baffert trainees comprising the entire field. And I know it came up reasonably fast. No points were awarded, obviously, with all of the runners being trained by Bob Baffert. I just don't know what to make of these horses. I know that Newgate, who won the race, has been steadily increasing his speed figures as of late, but it's just hard to gauge these horses that are only running against their stablemates.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I was a little bit surprised watching it. I mean, I had no interest in betting this race as I haven't looked at the handle numbers. I can't imagine too many people did. But it looked like they all ran pretty honestly. It didn't look like any shady tactics or, like any horses, what we saw like with Medina Spirit, where he was clearly pulled back not to race with Life is Good on the front end. So, I mean, I'll take the race at face value. I saw the buyer figure. I was a little surprised by that, honestly. I don't think the race was that good. At Timeform US, we're only giving it a 115, which equates to about a 95 buyer. It was the only route on the card, I believe, but even that, it's like I used a separate variant. If I had mixed it in with the sprints, it would be even a slower race, so I'm pretty happy with that 115. I guess it makes Newgate a contender. He did it fine. He looked okay. Hard to figure. The runner-up, I'm going to assume, took a pretty nice step forward, but I'm with you in that it's just hard to get excited about these horses because we don't know what lies in the future for them. They obviously, if they're going to be Derby contenders, are going to have to change barns, and that didn't work out very well last year.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen the pace figures for this race yet. It felt like the pace was pretty moderate to maybe on the slow side. It just seemed that way visually as well. I mean, they weren't really, as you said, there was no clear horse that needed the lead in this race that they sort of conceded to, but none of them were really pressing each other too hard on the front end. And I guess that's a big knock against Arabian Lion that he threw in the towel. He just seems like a horse that doesn't want to go this far. Newgate, he did pass this distance test. I'm still skeptical about how far this horse really wants to go, but he did get there, finished off this race a little better than his prior starts when he had shown a little bit of a tendency to hang. I thought that was the case when he was beaten by Reincarnate and the Sham in his prior race. Hard to figure him being this competitive on paper, but he definitely took a big step forward, and maybe Worcester was the slight disappointment. I know even though he was a maiden coming in, some people did like the race that he was coming out of and his ability to stretch out. Ran okay, but just couldn't quite get to the top 2. But it's just hard to know what to make of these horses and hard to really assess their standing in the greater Kentucky Derby picture. Craig, you might have seen I've started doing the Derby Watch videos for DRF this year with Brad Free, and we're compiling our top 20 every week. And it's really hard to know how many of these Bob Baffert horses to put in there because a lot is supposed to change between now and the first Saturday in May. As you said, the trainer changes, they have to happen by the end of February, unless there's some court ruling saying otherwise. And these horses have to hold their form. They still have to get the points to be on the starting gate. And it's just really hard to know how strong some of these California races are when it's only the Bob Baffert runners competing in them.
Yeah, and just to clean up a couple things, I forgot there was one other route, the first race, and this was the third, so they were run relatively close to each other. That was the first thing, and now something already escaped my mind what I was going to say, so we can just move on from that.
Well, we'll stick with the Bob Baffert theme, and he did have some other success on this Saturday card at Santa Anita. He also won the Grade 2 Santa Monica for the older fillies and mares, and Fun to Dream, Craig, just seems like a filly that's really come into her own. She took that big step forward when she won the La Brea last time out, and while the speed figure did dip a little bit here, she validated that performance, always traveled like a winner of this race, and was able to deliver as the odds-on favorite.
Yeah, and before we move on, I remembered it was the pace. I looked it up while you were talking, and it was on the moderate side. I'm not sure it will get any blue fractions, but they certainly weren't going to any fires on the front end. As for the Santa Monica, I was a little surprised in the speed figure. This race actually came back pretty slow on paper. My assistant did this figure. He broke it out to make it even faster to get it to where it is at a 109. I understand why he did, and I would have made the same decision. I think the track probably did change based on all the horses in the race. But that regression, it makes me wonder if maybe I don't have the La Brea a little too fast. That one was a little shaky at the time, so it's going to be something to monitor. I'm just not sure how strong these fillies are out in California.
Yeah, I remember we talked about it at the time. It was kind of tough to gauge that La Brea because based on the raw times, it had gone very close to Teba's Malibu. And I know you had kind of rated those races together. I think Bayer had rated them apart. It was kind of a tough call that day. And you always want to gather the evidence as these horses run back. I will say Fun to Dream. She didn't look like she was all out to win this race. She just seemed like she always kind of had this field at her mercy. She does also seem like a horse based on the fact that she's a daughter of Arrogate that is going to be able to stretch back out in distance. She has tried going longer in the past and was successful doing it. So I think based on the complexion of the older filly and mare division in California right now, which frankly is not that strong, there are a lot of races like this that she might be able to have success in.
Yeah, and I'll say maybe the pace had something to do with it. It really dipped in that second quarter. It slowed down quite a bit on the pace figures, and she did come from last in the field, so it could lend some credence to what you were saying. She probably could have moved earlier, could have won a bit easier than she even did. So yeah, maybe the figure's not worth holding against her too much in here. She's certainly getting the job done every time out.
Well, right after the Santa Monica on Saturday, they ran the Grade 3 Thunder Road, the last race of the day, going a mile on the turf. And Emily Gullickson, who I had on the podcast last week, the forecast, we handicapped this late pick 5 sequence at Santa Anita, and we were both pretty interested in the second place finisher De Jour, who somehow went off at 15-1 in this race. It was an amazing price on him. It all almost worked out except for the head bob at the very end. He just had his nose in front right before the wire and right after the wire. Just unfortunate to come out on the wrong end of that photo finish. That would have been a nice way to end this day. But Earl's Rock Craig, a horse that seems to have a propensity for working out perfect trips, was able to get another one and get the job done.
Yeah, he's one of those horses on turf that just has very good tactical speed. Something obviously went amiss, and he came back a gelding, and he's kind of worked his way back into form. This race did come back a pretty slow race. It's only getting a 111 TimeformUS speed figure, so I'm not sure what to make of these horses, but that was a tough beat for De Jour, no doubt. I was watching this race live. I hadn't had a chance to listen to your guys' podcast yet, but those kinds sting in this game. But if you keep betting horses like that at those kind of prices, it will work itself out.
Yeah, and he would be the one that I'd want out of this race between the top two. I mean, he was coming off a layoff of more than a year for Bob Baffert and had shown real promise early in his career. So if they can keep him going for his 5-year-old season, he does seem like a candidate to move forward off this a little bit mediocre 111 TimeformUS speed figure that the race got. The other horse I want to mention in this race is Dark Shift. Just love what Frankie Dettori did on this horse. Broke slowly, but really changed the complexion of the race by rushing up on him, because it looked on paper like Air Force Red was just going to have the lead to himself like he has in most of his prior starts. But Dettori got really aggressive to overcome that poor break with Dark Shift and was able to get him to the lead. And it really just took Air Force Red's best weapon away from him. And when you have a one-dimensional speed horse like that and don't allow him the early lead, it kind of does open up the race to some bigger prices. So almost worked out for the one that we liked in Du Jour, but just not quite. But I did want to mention Dettori's ride on Dark Shift, and that's another horse that might be able to move forward out of this race, just given his limited experience in this country.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, he was only beaten a length, so certainly one to look forward to going forward. I did find it interesting that Du Jour was back in the Bob Baffert barn. I believe he owns the horse, if memory serves. And he had obviously had to change barns, I guess, or did change barns because he couldn't run in New York. But yeah, he's back in the hands of his trainer. Bob Baffert doesn't have a lot of success on turf, but this was one horse he did have success with, winning the Grade 2 American on Derby Day.
Yeah, and that brings up, I mean, I'm kind of getting off topic here, but that brings up an interesting point. I kind of am interested to see what happens with the Triple Crown Trail this year with Bob Baffert having so many of these good 3-year-olds. He only has to change trainers for the Kentucky Derby. I think he can trade horses in the Preakness and the Belmont, and I think it depends on who he gives these horses to. And I know that ban of Bob Baffert racing in New York has expired recently, so I'll be interested to see how these trainer changes transpire over the next few months. I don't think we've gotten any information on that yet, but with Bob Baffert having such a stranglehold on the top 3-year-olds out there, I think that it's going to have a significant impact on the Triple Crown this year.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's going to be interesting to see. And you are right. I do believe he can run in the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes. The problem is he has so many horses. Where are these horses going to go? I know you put out a list about the buyer figures and the 3-year-olds. Now that I have the figures from Saturday, I'm going to go ahead and do that for Timeform US as well. I'll just reply to your tweet. It should be something interesting to see. But yeah, with so many races out there and not giving points, it's going to be a scramble at the end, and it's going to make for interesting look to see, because there's obviously going to be a lot less points available, and the limits are going to be lower, I would imagine, the cutoffs to get into the field because of it.
Yeah, and what Greg is mentioning, I put out a tweet last week just kind of showing a graph of the, or I should say a spreadsheet of the top buyer speed figures for this 3-year-old crop, both last year and this year, where they were 2-year-olds and now 3-year-olds, and of the horses that have run buyers of 95 or higher, Bob Baffert has been the trainer of 64% of those performances, just kind of a staggering number of the concentration of talent within the Bob Baffert stable. It's not just the perception, the numbers agree with it. So it's going to be interesting to see how this all transpires on the rest of this Kentucky Derby trail leading up to the first Saturday in May. But let's get back on track and move on to Sunday at Santa Anita, Craig, where, well, we're going to actually go back to the Bob Baffert stable, because he had the winner of the Grade 3 Palos Verdes with the older horse, Hopkins, a horse that I know they had tried to stretch out a little bit earlier, or I should say later last year, but they've gone back to sprinting with him. I think that's really what this horse wants to do, and probably not the toughest graded stakes you're ever going to see in Southern California, but the sprint division needs some new players, so maybe Hopkins can develop into that kind of horse.
Yeah, we're starting to see some of them. We're going to talk about another one later at a different track, but I thought this was a pretty good effort by Hopkins. I don't have the official speed figure yet, but I'm guessing it's going to be around the 122 range. So it kind of gets him back to that really fast maiden race that he was in. Who knows? Maybe the figure was a little off in that one, because that one just came back super fast and the top two never really matched it until now, but It was a good, strong effort. It wasn't the toughest field that he beat in here. He was 2-1 for a reason. I was actually a little surprised he went off as high as he did because he looked more like an even money shot to me on paper, and that's how he won. So I like that he has tactical speed. He didn't have to go to the lead. He was able to sit right off that Dan Blacker horse, who's pretty quick, and went to the front and just wore him down and drew away. So the future's bright. I doubt they're going to stretch this one out. And like you said, we need some decent sprinters, something we haven't seen a lot of the last couple years.
Yeah, the one concerning thing I'll note about this race is he didn't change leads in the stretch, and that's kind of an odd thing to note for a horse that's already making the seventh start of his career. He just kind of hung on that left lead, and Juan Hernandez was trying to get him to switch over. He was kind of leaning to the left to try to get him to take that extra step to switch over to his right lead, and it never really happened. I guess it didn't matter for his performance because he still finished pretty strongly and was able to beat the competition that he was facing. Interesting runner-up in here, Radical Right, a horse that I know we had talked about when he was in his prior barn racing on the Maryland circuit. I was kind of looking up his PPs to make sure I wasn't, confusing him with somebody else. It was the same horse. He has been purchased since then, and now he's with Peter Miller. But I'm not sure what that really says about the division in Southern California because Radical Right was just kind of a high-level allowance horse at Laurel, and now he's achieving this graded stakes placing at Santa Anita. So maybe he has improved for Peter Miller, but I think that just speaks to the fact that there's not a whole lot of depth in this division right now.
Yeah, I was happy with it because it showed the speed figures transfer pretty well because his speed figures fit pretty good, and he ran a good solid race. He's the horse, if I remember right, we were talking, we couldn't figure out why they kept him on turf for so long, and he has really blossomed since he went to back to dirt.
Yes, you're right. I think we talked about one of those allowance races that it might have been Delaware or Laurel on the one of the pace casts because he did run a pretty fast speed figure in a few of those. Let's move on to some maiden races before we move away from Santa Anita. They had some pretty fast maiden winners on both Saturday and Sunday's card. On Saturday, there was a California-bred maiden race won by the 3-year-old gelding Bus Buzz. And Craig, I know you had tweeted about this when you saw the race live. I'm not sure, where this horse came from. He didn't take a whole lot of money. He went off at 6-1 in this spot against Calbreds, but this horse seems like he can really run, and he has a ton of early speed.
Yeah, he's going to get a 114 Timeform US speed figure. That is pace adjusted. I think the final time's more around the 109 mark, which is still pretty darn good for a debut for a 3-year-old. He does look like a sprinter to me for sure, particularly the way he ran this day. Now he's young, maybe he could change. He is by Stay Thirsty, so maybe there's a little stamina there, but just the way he ran looks to me like a really fast sprinter. It'll be interesting to see where he shows up. I would imagine I would move him right in the Calbred Stakes and see how he can do against that division because he was certainly impressive very fast in this one.
Yeah, I mean, this horse, he broke with the field, but you could see in that opening furlong or two, I mean, he just, Edwin Maldonado had a tough trouble getting a hold of him because he just wanted to run away from the rest of the horses, and he opened up on the far turn and just never let anybody else get into the race, going fast early and late. It's kind of funny looking at his pedigree, even though he is by Stay Thirsty, who you think of as more of a stamina influence. His dam was a very good sprinter, and kind of funny, his dam, her greatest achievement was winning the Santa Monica, and this horse actually debuted on Santa Monica Day and was able to win his debut. So the future looks pretty bright for Bus Buzz, especially given the fact that he has that California-bred eligible status. And then moving on to Sunday's card at Santa Anita, we saw an open maiden special weight race for the 3-year-old fillies. A Bob Baffert first-time starter took all the money in here. Conquistar was bet down to, I think, 1-5, but it was the Michael McCarthy trainee, Clearly Unhinged, who broke from the rail, got to the front end, and never looked back.
Yeah, it's kind of funny when you sent this. I just assumed it was a Bob Baffert horse, which I guess wasn't the smartest thing to do. As it turned out, it was not, but it was a pretty quick race. Unhinged, I would guess. I don't have officially. He's going to get about a 110 Timeform US speed figure, so good solid debut for this. The Bob Baffert horse ran fine. I just think he got beat by a better horse on this day.
Yeah, I thought the Bavard horse ran okay. Maybe the buzz was a little bit overblown with that horse, but clearly unhinged. I liked the way that she was able to kick away at the top of the stretch. She's a daughter of Into Mischief who looks like she's got a lot of size and bulk to her, so definitely seems like one that might be geared more towards the sprinting, at least for now. But we'll see what they decide to do with her because there clearly is plenty of talent here.
Yeah, if that 110 is what my assistant comes up with, that's pretty good for a 3-year-old filly this time of year. We haven't seen that in many stakes races even.
Let's move on to Gulfstream Park, where they also ran a prep race for the Kentucky Derby on Saturday. That was the Grade 3 Holy Bull, and there were some qualifying points awarded in this one, with no Bob Baffert runners entering the gate. Rocket Can got the job done here, earning those 20 Kentucky Derby qualifying points as the winner of this race. But Craig, the speed figure came back pretty slow. To me, it's not a big surprise. Just going in, this didn't look like the strongest Derby prep, and one of the two major players for Dale Rowans just completely failed to show up. Cyclone Mischief, he wasn't really a factor in this race, and that allowed Rocket Can to get the job done, but it's hard to say where this horse really fits in the larger Derby picture.
It is. I will say, as a bettor, I was happy he won on this day because he came in with the same figure as Cyclone Mischief, 104 last race, and he did it back in November. I couldn't really figure out why the heavy betting on Cyclone Mischief, but the bettors are never as dumb as I think they're going to be. Rocket Can only wound off going off 5-2. I thought he ran fine. I don't want to knock him too much for his speed figure because he was really wide on both turns, which isn't surprising when you draw the outside post at Gulfstream going that mile and a 16th with the short stretch. So I thought he ran fine, even though he only got a 102 speed figure. I would say he definitely improved off of his 2-year-old form. It just doesn't show numerically. That said, there's still a ways to go for a horse like this to compete with some of the other 3-year-olds we've seen.
I agree. He's got some a big step forward to take if he's going to be competitive in Derby preps moving down the line. I will say, I mean, you already pointed out the wide trip. This is a horse who just was kind of goofy last year. I liked him in his first couple races at Saratoga, and it just looked like he didn't have it all put together then. And he's really blossomed since going around the two turns. Even though he is a son of Into Mischief, he's got a lot of stamina on the bottom side of his pedigree, and it's nice to see him putting it all together. But I do wonder where the ceiling is. He got a 102 TimeformUS speed figure for this race. I don't know if he explicitly said that, which is right in line with the 82 buyer that he got. There was not a big difference between the two numbers for this one, like there was with the race out in California. Just a slow race overall, and it's really hard to look at the horses in behind him and argue that this was a stronger race than that speed figure might suggest, because the second and third place finishers just really hadn't accomplished much up until this point. So he's got the points to at least put him in the conversation right now, but you have to hope for a step forward from this horse in the future.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, if there's any horse you want out of here, it's him. It would be a real stretch for me to go with any of the others moving forward as we go to races like the Fountain of Youth and Florida Derby. It just doesn't seem like any of these are of that quality.
I think the horse that got a lot of people talking on Saturday at Gulfstream Park was the eighth race allowance winner, Tappet Trice. And Craig, you know this is a horse that I've had an affinity for some time now. I think I've written you like a couple of emails just trying to get you to bump up that maiden win speed figure for him. Maybe that time has passed. But this horse did face winners for the first time in this allowance race and certainly passed the test with flying colors. He is still breaking a little bit slowly out of the gate, which you don't like to see. But when this horse gets into top gear, I mean, he finishes up really powerfully. I love the way he extends his stride and certainly got the sense that more distance is not going to be a problem.
No, he looked very good on Saturday. I didn't see this race live. I went back and watched the replay because, based on horse racing Twitter, I thought maybe Spectacular Bid had run, and he did look good. I'm just joking mostly. He only got a 105 speed figure from us, which surprised me a little bit. Final time was a 107, but I think when you consider the break, the pretty wide trip and the one-turn mile, and the fact that the pace was slow, the figure actually makes a lot of sense, and he's probably better than that 105, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, he was finishing off this race in a different class than the rest of the horses in this field, and he was beating a Todd Pletcher-trained stablemate who actually went favored over him, surprisingly. Shesterkin took more money off his debut win, which did come back a little bit faster, at least on the Timeform US numbers, than Tapit Trice had run, but clearly one of them wanted the more distance as opposed to the other, and Tapit Trice, I mean, he's bred to go much farther than even a mile, being a son of Tapit. The Dam was a stakes-winning router. The Dam is a three-quarter sister to Jaywalk, that Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies winner. So there's definitely the pedigree for this horse to blossom into a Kentucky Derby type. I would imagine that we're going to try a prep race next, probably or almost certainly around 2 turns, and I think we'll learn a lot more about him in that start. Let's move on to another race that could possibly be a Derby prep, the Grade 3 Swale. Obviously, no points awarded for this one, being it a sprint race, but General Jim, the winner here, is trained by Shug McGahee, a Kentucky Derby winning trader, Shug McGahee. General Jim, though, Craig, he's kind of a hard horse to get a handle on. He initially came to hand as a turf horse, switched back over to the dirt, had a trip in the Mucho Macho Man 2-back, did do much better getting the victory in this race, but it's hard to know if he's going to be a real Kentucky Derby type of 2-turn dirt horse.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. He got a 104 speed figure for this race. He had a pretty nice pace set up in here, chasing the really fast Super Chow, who just seemed to kind of get away on the turn, but couldn't really finish out the race. And yeah, I'm not sure what to make of this one. The one thing you could give him, he's versatile. Like you said, he's run fine on the turf, had that nice allowance win at Keeneland. Now he's won a stake on the dirt. I found it interesting that Shug McGahee cut him back in distance for this race. I guess it's a logical spot, but for me, that also doesn't scream Kentucky Derby that he would have moved him back to 7 furlongs here.
Yeah, it was a little bit strange not to see him entered in the Holy Bowl, especially given the way that race came up. I imagine he could have potentially vied for favoritism in that race, especially off his obvious trip in the prior race. But they decided to go this route instead. He won it, and we'll see what they decide to do next. Maybe they'll look at a race like the Gotham, since he seems like a horse that has been doing well, at least did well here in this one-turn race. But yeah, I'm a little bit skeptical that he's going to want to go much farther in distance than what he's been excelling at up to this point in his career.
Yeah, and I did want to mention Super Chow. He got a little tired. He's actually getting a faster speed figure than General Jim with a 109 for that fast pace. And this race was at 7 furlongs. It seems like it's a little too far, but he's fast, and he's going to be a dangerous horse at 6 furlongs.
I completely agree with that. He's a nice horse. He can be a tough to ride. He can be a little bit of a runoff type. We've seen him try to drift out pretty badly in a few of his starts. It seems like they've got a handle on that for now. But he's definitely a talented sprinter, and he's one that I don't think they have any illusions about trying to stretch him out. He's just a fast horse that they're probably going to concentrate on these shorter races with. Let's move on to a turf race for the 3-year-olds that they ran on. I'm sorry, before we go to the turf race, let's slot in the filly counterpart to the Swale. That was the Grade 3 Forward Gal. Don't want to go without mentioning the winner of this race, Red Carpet Ready, the undefeated filly, who is now 3 for 3 in her career for trainer Rusty Arnold. And I mean, speaking of a turf race, which we're going to go to next, this filly actually has more of a turf pedigree, being by Oscar Performance, but she's done well on the dirt so far, and you had to like the way that she stepped up against some tougher company here and handled the challenge.
Did like this race. She keeps moving forward from her debut 89 to a 97 as last race as a 2-year-old, all the way up to a 102 here. Just keeps getting better. She has that good tactical speed where she doesn't have to have the lead. Her post position helped here, but she was able to take advantage of it after not starting the greatest. And I just liked what I saw from her. She does kind of look like a sprinter to me. I'm not sure she's the kind that you really want to stretch out too far. I'll leave that to you, but she's done nothing but win and win easily in her first 3 starts.
Yeah, she's a horse that I do think that longer distances are a bit of a question for her, but I like the way she moves. I mean, the way that she just like extended her stride and was able to put some distance between herself and her main competitors at the top of the stretch really impressed me. She kind of has the turn of foot of a turf horse, but is able to do it on the dirt. So they definitely have some big races in this division for the 3-year-old fillies around 1 turn. So I imagine they'll target those. And based on the kind of numbers that she's running right now, she's as fast fast as any 3-year-old filly out there. We just haven't seen too many noteworthy speed figures from the 3-year-old females at this point in time. So I think that she definitely is going to be a major player in any of the races they target moving forward. And now we'll move over to the turf and talk about that Kitten's Joy Stakes, a Grade 3 event that they also ran on that Saturday card at Gulfstream Park. And Craig, this might be the most talented 3-year-old that we saw run on Saturday, as Major Dude got the job done here, reversing his decision with Candidate, who had beaten him in his prior start at Gulfstream. And Major Dude probably had the pace against him in that race where he was beaten, but was able to get a little bit of help from his stablemate Dude in Colorado on this day, who was able to get to the front end and set the table for Major Dude. But this horse ran a pretty nice speed figure for February, or I should say late January of this 3-year-old season.
Yeah, this horse is good, and I think it was a wise move by Todd Pletcher to get I won't say a rabbit, because Dude in Colorado ran pretty good, but I think it was one of those either or where he was going to run and make sure Canada didn't get an easy early lead. He didn't, and Major Dude proved that result. He was able to turn the tables. I mean, I won't say that result was a fluke, but Canada definitely had the better trip that day. This is a horse who's definitely progressing in the right direction, and a 110 this earlier in the year for a 3-year-old, that's pretty good. He looks like he could be a serious turf runner.
Yeah, I agree with that. This was a nice step forward for him, and he had shown promise last year, winning that Pilgrim Stakes. Obviously, the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf with the Euros in there just ended up being a little bit too tough for him, but he's been blossoming pretty nicely in the winter down in Florida, so definitely a horse that looks like a major player in this division moving forward. Let's also talk about a couple of maiden and allowance races that were run last week at Gulfstream Park, and both of them were won by Todd Pletcher trainees, so we'll stick with that theme. On Friday, Lakota Territory, who was a 4-year-old first-time starter, got the job done in his debut, facing off against another first-time starter for Bill Mott, who was actually 5 years old, and these two put on a pretty nice show to the wire.
This one I really wasn't feeling very well, but I watched this race. I even tweeted about it. For some reason, I assumed that Bill Mott was just a 4-year-old. It was so odd to see a 5-year-old debut, but these two horses could run. They both wound up with 109 speed figures. There was a huge gap back to third. I think the third place finisher was beaten 10 lengths. And that horse was Citizen Mac, a horse who's run some pretty nice speed figures in defeat as a maiden. So these two look good. The final time figures were actually quicker. The pace was pretty slow. They got a 113 and 112 respectively final time figures. So these could be two to watch out for. Obviously, they had some issues to make their debut so late, but they're in the hands of good solid trainers who took their time, and I was impressed by this one.
And we should also mention that Lakota Territory's victory was part of a 7-win day on this Friday card for jockey Irad Ortiz, actually winning 7 races in a row, something that's almost unheard of in this game. I mean, they were a lot of short prices, but still, you need some skill in addition to having the right mounts to have that level of success on one afternoon. And Lakota Territory definitely was able to get the job done with that little bit of extra help on his back. And as you said, kind of odd to see these two horses, a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old, putting on this kind of show in their debuts, but the speed figures say that these could be stakes-bound horses. You said the 109 TimeformUS number. I think they got a 113 final time number for this race, and Beyer had it even faster. I know these Gulfstream days can be tough to make speed figures for. I only imagine just with the 3 different surfaces, you're not getting that large of a sample size, especially on the dirt, but definitely whether you have this race higher or not, these are two talented horses. And Lakota Territory, I remember I had been watching some of the Pletcher workouts on XBTV, actually trying to evaluate a horse coming off a long layoff, Overstep, that recently won at Aqueduct, and that experienced horse had worked with Lakota Territory, and I remember thinking to myself, oh, I'm a little bit against Overstep coming back off the layoff because he's been beaten in the workout by this unraced horse. Well, turns out that unraced horse is now experienced and pretty good. And as for a la carte, I'm looking up his PPs right here, and The odd thing about him is when you see these 5-year-olds debut, you often look at their workout patterns and just see a bunch of gaps. They were trying to make the races and had setbacks. He didn't have the first workout, his first timed workout, until the very end of his 4-year-old season. So must have just been a horse they had on the farm. I don't know, had an issue and they just kind of been sitting on for a long time before putting him into serious trading. But he's pretty good.
No doubt. And I'm glad you mentioned Gulfstream. It's just something to keep in mind as a handicapper. The speed figures are probably not as solid as some other tracks. You mentioned the 3 surfaces, and sometimes it's even 4 when they start moving using 2 different turf rails on the same day. So it is definitely different from some other tracks. I try to use the codes when the figures are tough to let people know the track code or figure codes where we let you know why it might have been tough. So if you see those, it's probably good to heed that there are a lot of tough figures to make at Gulfstream.
And sticking with the theme of Todd Pletcher trained winners, let's wrap up Gulfstream by talking about a Sunday allowance race won by Charge It, the much anticipated return of Charge It, who in his prior race had absolutely demolished the field in the Dwyer by 23 lengths. I think we had given him a 133 TimeformUS speed figure for that performance, Craig, which has held up over time. I was tweeting about the Dwyer yesterday that even though he beat some horses by 23 lengths that didn't look very good at the time, they've actually horses that have turned out to be okay. And Charge It made his much anticipated return here and won by a length and a half, Craig, but I don't think that the margin of victory tells the whole story.
No, and before I get to that, the Dwyer, you're absolutely right. Every horse in that race has come back to run significantly faster since then, other than Charge It, obviously, who hasn't had a chance until Sunday. Yeah, I was impressed by this effort. I don't think he was ever really asked to do his best running. It's probably not a distance that is great for him. I think he's going to be better as they go longer, even though the Dwyer came, I think it was just a 1-turn mile. He's always looked like a horse to me who's going to get better as the races get longer. He just never really got the chance. He was kind of thrown in the Kentucky Derby pretty early in his career, just his 4th race off a pretty good but green race in the Florida Derby. Don't think he was really ready that day, but the horse we've seen the last 2 could be a very serious player in the older horse division, one that's really looking for horses to be serious players.
And the thing that I like, Craig, is that it seems like he's really grown up mentally. You might remember when we were talking about this horse last year and we did our Kentucky Derby preview, I think we were a little bit concerned about this horse handling the stress of the Kentucky Derby. He was just kind of a goofball in his races, was awkwardly changing leads, just looking unfocused in the stretch. And it feels like all that's behind him now. He took that big step forward in the Dwyer. And once again here, he just looked like a much more manageable horse. I mean, he was a little bit keen off the layoff in the early portions of this race, and they were moving up front. I know that the pace figures aren't color-coded in red. I would imagine that they were kind of on the bubble because the leaders were going a pretty good clip, and the horses that were setting that pace that Charge It was pressing, I mean, they dropped away and they were beaten some 19, 20 or more lengths in here. It was really the deeper closers that were getting closer to Charge It at the end of this race, and he was just under a very light hand ride from Louis Saez. So he's certainly an exciting horse. I think he got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure on this day. Feels like one that can certainly be built upon in the future when he tries stakes company again. And the handicap division, Craig, I think as we saw in the Pegasus, it's sort of in flux right now, and a horse like Charge It could add a lot if he's able to return in top form as a 4-year-old.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of saying. It's a division crying out for new horses, and this is a horse I'm actually excited about. Some of it's because of that big figure he ran last year, but there's just not a lot of horses out there that have those type of figures on their resume. So I'm really hoping that he stays healthy and can keep progressing forward because he's one that excites me quite a bit.
Well, let's stay in Florida, but move on over to Tampa Bay Downs to talk about the 2 graded stakes that they ran on the turf on Saturday. And I guess we'll continue with our string of Todd Pletcher trained winners as he sent out the minor upset winner of the Tampa Bay Stakes, Emmanuel, a horse that I can't say that I've ever been the biggest fan of Craig, and I was especially skeptical of him coming back in this race, which seemed like a pretty salty group of turf horses that had run some nice speed figures. And Emmanuel had just not really run this kind of number yet, especially not in his two turf races, having only won that Pennine Ridge, which just was not the most competitively run affair last year at Belmont Park. But clearly, this is a horse that has taken a big step forward from his 3-year-old to 4-year-old season.
Yeah, this is one I had to go back and double and triple check when I did the speed figures because it came up a 123. And though he was a horse who I think showed some talent, he was a horse they tried to put on the Derby trail. Didn't really work out. They moved him to turf. He ran okay. Then he disappeared after that Saratoga Derby, but it looks like turf is a surface for him because that figure checks out totally legit. There were 4 turf races, all run in close proximity to each other at Tampa. It was a really solid day for speed figure making, so I don't know what changed with this horse, but he looked like a new horse on Saturday.
He really did. He had kind of looked like a horse who needed a lead to be most effective in that Pennine Ridge score from last year. And in this race, he rated kindly, made that sweeping move around the field on the turn to take the lead. And I mean, I had picked Verbal in this race at 13-1 and was kind of, licking my chops when he peeled out at the top of the stretch and was going to make that run. And it quickly became apparent that Emmanuel was not coming back to the field after making that sweep to the front end. So I agree. It seemed like a legitimate performance, and the horses in behind them. I mean, we've talked about Win From Within a few times. This is a horse that you've had some affinity for, Craig. I mean, he's just like a machine. He keeps running those low 120 speed figures, and he doesn't always win these races, but he can set a fast pace and still finish off his races. He's pretty game, and maybe there'll be one of these races coming along with his name on it that he's able to actually get the victory for. But I mean, he's a pretty good barometer to measure against when it comes to the speed figures, and he finished a good second here with that same 123 speed figure.
Yeah, and I hate to say it's a tough beat when your horse ran fourth in here, but he improved his speed figure 21 points. Now, a lot of that he hadn't run since April as a 3-year-old, not quite, or even more extreme than Emmanuel, who hadn't been seen since August. So you do expect some improvement, but that was a pretty big jump, and I think this was a pretty solid field. As I look through the chart, it was, as you said, a good, deep, strong field, and I really liked what Emmanuel did. He was pulling away from a good group.
Before we move on, I do want to mention the beaten favorite in this race, Chez Pierre, who was probably overbet coming off the layoff at 3-2. He did not run nearly as badly as that 6th place finish might suggest. The trip just didn't work out for him. He was 3-4 wide around both turns with no cover. That's a tough trip for any horse on any day, but especially coming off the kind of layoff that he was, to have that taxing of a trip, it's not surprising that he couldn't get the job done here, and really wasn't beaten that far to be 6th in this race. And he's a horse that had shown a lot of talent last year when he first came to this country, had been undefeated coming into this race, so he's one that I would be willing to give another shot to.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I liked what I saw. He actually ran the speed figure he did. I remember he was an exciting horse when he first showed up in this country. Had run 2 really nice races, first 2 out. So he's one I would definitely expect to improve next time.
And the other graded stakes that they ran on Saturday at Tampa Bay Downs was the Grade 3 Endeavor, going that same mile and the 16th distance. This one for the fillies and mares. And Craig, for me, it never gets old seeing those Phipps colors cross the wire first in a major race. Surprisingly, going out for the Phipps stable here with Shug McGahee as the trainer. It just brings up some memories of my childhood and watching those Phipps horses in the 90s just have so much success. And clearly the stable is a much smaller operation than it once was. But I mean, you can look through Surprisingly's pedigree and see some of the bloodlines there. It's just always neat to see these horses have some success. And I'm not exactly sure where this improvement came from, but it is Shug McGahee's MO to get these horses to just gradually improve over time and peak when they're in their 4-year-old or 5-year-old seasons.
Yeah, it is his MO, and I'm with you. I love seeing these colors win. I wish I could say the 90s were my childhood, but they were not, alas. But yeah, surprisingly ran fine. She got a 113 speed figure, so just kind of that same steady, gradual improvement we see some from Shug McGahee runners. This race was a good comparison to the race we talked about previously that Emmanuel won. They're both run at the same distance, just two races apart. Neither was a big influence by pace, I don't believe. This one was a little more moderate than the other one, but it was just part of what was a really solid speed figure making day. So surprisingly, as a filly, given that MO of Shug McGahee, I wouldn't be surprised if she took another step forward next time because I liked what I saw from her. It's not like she got a great setup to come from as far back as she did, and she was still able to mow him down.
Yeah, I agree. The pace of this race was actually slower than the other one, but I will say Paco Lopez gave surprisingly a fantastic ride. When you go back and watch this, I mean, he saved ground every step of the way, went around another horse, started right back to the rail to cut the corner coming off the far turn. And I think some other riders maybe got a little bit too aggressive around that far turn. Sammy Camacho and market segmentation tried to make that early blitz to the lead between horses at the quarter pole and got there, but just couldn't quite see off the race. And I think it left both her and Scottish Star vulnerable to that late surge from Surprisingly, who saved all that ground. And I agree. I mean, I've never viewed her as the kind of horse that was destined for graded stakes success, but it does feel like she's becoming a better horse than it seemed like she had the potential to last summer, and we've seen that before from the Shug McGahee barn. So I'll be interested to see what these horses can do moving forward. Let's move on to Oaklawn Park, where they did run a graded stakes on Saturday by Akoa. We're not going to talk about that. That division out in Arkansas just hasn't really been that strong, and none of the races have gotten particularly strong speed figures. But we will talk about an allowance race from Sunday, won by Cogburn, a Steve Asmussen trainee, going the 6 furlong distance. And this is a horse that had some buzz early in the career, Craig. I think he's been favored in all of his races up until this point. Last round in the Chick Lang on Preakness Day, going all the way back to May of last year. So coming off the long layoff here, and he had to work for this victory, but I think you had to like what you saw, just given the fact that he had a right to be a little bit rusty off the 9-month break.
Yeah, he didn't particularly look rusty though, and he came back with a 122 speed figure, which is exactly what he had run in the Chick Lang back in May as a 3-year-old. So he's definitely another horse that has some potential to break into this stakes horse sprint division for older horses. Certainly running the kind of speed figures that you need to win the big races these days. So he's trained by a guy who's obviously had a lot of success in graded sprint stakes, and I imagine that's where we're going to see him next because this was a pretty big effort.
Yeah, and I liked the middle portions of this race when he handled that unexpected challenge to his inside pretty well. I think that horse Improbable Journey is his name, ranged up on the rail, just kind of his jockey couldn't hold him, and he aggressively tried to make the front end around the far turn, and Cogburn just kind of let him come through on the inside, set off that horse, and then put him away when the real running started in the stretch, and then was able to fend off other challenges in the run into the wire. So I think Cogburn did show a lot of likable attributes in this race, and a little bit more grit than we had seen from him in his races last year. So yeah, this sprint division, it can use some new players, and I feel like Cogburn could be a candidate to make a splash in a graded stakes pretty soon. And speaking of the Steve Asmussen barn, we'll also talk about a 3-year-old that he sent out on the Saturday card, and that is Gun Pilot. Craig, this race, probably not the toughest allowance, kind of like that Tappet Trice race that we talked about at Gulfstream Park. I'm not sure if you really want anybody else in this field behind Gun Pilot, but I did like the way this horse finished off the race, and this result certainly flatters Verifying, who had easily handled him in a similar spot about a month ago at Oaklawn Park.
Yeah, I like that Steve Asmussen kept him going the 2 turns to give him another shot against what's obviously a little bit of a weaker field, but I'd say he took a step forward. His speed figure improved this time up to a 102 from a 99, so he's a horse who could keep progressing. He's obviously got some ground to make up if he's going to be a Derby Trail horse, but he's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, when I initially saw the result, I wasn't expecting to be too impressed by this race, and he got a good trip, all things considered. But I just liked the final eighth of a mile, the way he really lengthened his stride, and given there wasn't a whole lot behind him, but he's a horse that I will say I'm intrigued by. He's got a lot of ground to make up, as you said, on some of the top 3-year-olds out there, especially in the points race. But he's one that I'll be interested to see when he probably makes his stakes debut in his next start.
Well, I mean, I think the good sign with him is he was able to come from off the pace, even though it was a good trip, as you say. He's a horse who's been right up battling on the front end. Not that speed's ever really a bad thing, but it's good to have options, and he showed that here.
Let's move on to Aqueduct. We'll just talk about one race from there. On Sunday, they ran a 1 mile high level allowance race, and Craig, it was the first time back in the winner's circle for the 2021 Wood Memorial winner Bourbonic, a horse that achieved that 72-1 upset seemingly out of nowhere, sort of descended back into obscurity after that, but nice to see him finally get back in the winner's circle and receive that little confidence boost.
Yeah, I watched this race on Sunday, and my first thought was I hope David bet him because I seem to remember you liked him in his prior effort a bit in the stakes race. He didn't run. I mean, he ran okay that day. He was maybe a little over his head, but at 7-2 in this field, I was a little surprised he went off quite so high. Sheriff Bianco had been in good form, but was trying to stretch out quite a bit, and that always seemed a little bit iffy. So it was a good effort. It's not like Bourbonic had a ton of pace to close into in here. The pace was moderate to say at least some of the fractions are even in blue. So I thought it was a good effort. A 117 speed figure has him moving in the right direction, I would say. And I'm not even sure the mile is his best distance.
Yeah, I probably I probably should have picked him on top because I had done a little spotlight on him in one of my horses to watch videos recently, and did not allow that to sway me to put him as my top pick in this race. That actually happened twice on this Sunday card, where horses that I had highlighted the trips of one back that I didn't pick. So not the smartest moves by me, but Bourbonic, yes, it is good to see him make that last to first rush through the stretch at Aqueduct, and obviously wasn't beating as tough a field here as he would likely meet if he moved back into graded stakes company. But sometimes it's just the confidence boost that these horses need to start a run of good form anew. So we'll see where Bourbonic is able to go from here. We'll wrap things up, Craig, with another allowance race. This one run earlier in the week at Parks, a venue that we don't talk about that often, but sometimes the speed figures just necessitate that you put these races on the list and mention them, and I don't know where it came from, but Malibu Star in this starter allowance race earned a 121 and looked like the kind of horse that could be competitive in a graded stakes if he were able to translate this form, but it's hard to know sometimes what to make of these Parks races.
Yeah, it was one when the speed figure came up. I was like, uh-oh, I don't know what to do with this one, but it was a pretty solid day for speed figure making. There wasn't a whole lot I could do other than just guess to make it a lower figure. I mean, it's not like he didn't win by 9.5 lengths or over 9 lengths for the second time in a row. Not sure where these races came from. It took the new barn. He was claimed for 25,000, I think 5 starts back. He's been progressing forward ever since, and this time he just made that huge jump. So don't know where this one will show up next and if we'll be able to reproduce that 121, but I would say on Wednesday it was a legitimate number that he ran.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what are the right words to use, but it does seem like these magical feats sometimes do happen at Parks. I mean, this is a horse that had run in New York last year and could barely get out of his way in a bottom level claiming race, and went to Parks and initially ran for a $77,500 tag. Clearly, he's come a long way since then, and he looked like he could have run through a brick wall last Wednesday. So, I mean, he's obviously feeling pretty good right now. These are connections in an ownership group that has had a lot of horses make sort of miraculous form reversals recently, and there's been a little reporting about that. But just a speed figure that I thought couldn't go without being mentioned, because this horse really did put forth an impressive performance. I just don't know what its predictive value moving forward is, and if we're going to see this kind of performance outside of Parks.
No, I agree. I'm not really familiar with the trainer. I'll be honest, when I saw the figure, the first thing I did was go look to see who the trainer was. So I'm obviously going to have to read up because I was surprised it wasn't one of the usual suspects.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm supposed to plug a non-DRF author, but Natalie Voss did do some reporting on this if you want to check it out for yourself. But Malibu Star was a horse that once was very well meant when he was in the Kelly Breen barn. He had a lot of talent early in his career, so the building blocks were there. And actually, even before that, he started out in the Bob Baffert stable. So he's come a long way. And oddly enough, to just kind of bring things full circle, he's the half-brother to Arabian Lion, who competed in the first race we talked about on this podcast, the Robert B. Lewis. Always connections to make in horse racing. So now that I've achieved that little bit of sleight of hand, we'll wrap up this podcast. And Greg, it was great to have you back on this week, and we'll of course be back to do the TimeformUS forecast later in the week. And I haven't done a whole lot of looking ahead yet. I know that they're running another big day at Tampa Bay Downs with the Sam F. Davis being their first major Derby prep of the season on Saturday, so maybe we'll see how that card comes up.
Yeah, I haven't looked ahead at all. I always have a little soft spot because I went to the Sam Davis a few years back and really loved my trip to Tampa and to Clearwater Beach and hope to get back there someday, but maybe I can live vicariously through it while handicapping.
Well, you can look forward to that coming out on Friday, and I'm sure we'll put something about which sequence we decide to handicap. Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming up later in the week.